Mr. Hunt, I want to turn to just some information in 2014-2015 that would either have come to your attention or to the attention of the department. And then I want to look at various documents relating to options for review of the financial assistance schemes. So picking it up, first of all, in 2014, you've explained in your statement that you met with, along with Jane Ellison, with campaigners, including Mike Doricott, in 2014 to hear directly from campaigners their concerns.
Correct.
And you've also said that your recollection of the meeting is consistent with the description that's been given to the inquiry by Anne, Mike's widow.
Correct.
What was your sense then in 2014 of what it was that campaigners were seeking?
Well, I think I can't. I don't know how much of this I thought in 2014. Some of this may have been gaps that were filled in later, but I think my overwhelming sense around that period was that here was a situation where a terrible injustice had happened. It was not dissimilar to the injustice that had happened at Mid-Staffs with the families who'd lost loved ones there and been shut out, or at Morecambe Bay, or at Southern Health, or a number of other instances where I'd found these scandals had happened, but that it was going to be very difficult to find resolution because the Treasury had made it clear that any funding, any extra funding, would have to come from the Department of Health's own resources, and we had run out of money. I mean, we were in an absolutely desperate state financially. We were constantly going around trying to find money that we could put into the NHS front line. We were raiding capital budgets for the construction of new hospitals in order to fund the costs of frontline doctors and nurses. That was my motivation for seeking the £10 billion rise in the NHS budget in 2015, which we talked about earlier, and it became my motivation for seeking a £20 billion rise in the NHS budget in 2018. But I knew that to do justice to the wrong that had happened was likely to be a multi-billion pound settlement, and the national finances would not allow that, and the Treasury certainly would not allow that, and that's why they were saying to me. So I had a sense, I suppose, if you ask me how I felt, of great frustration that it was going to be difficult to make progress.
And then if we come to 2015, MACF 5059_047. This is a document dated the 10th of February 2015. It's from the Haemophilia Society. It's addressed to Jane Ellison. It's right to note, if we go to the bottom of the next page, it's copied to you, but you tell us in your statement that that doesn't mean that you would have seen it.
Correct.
But if we just go back to the first page, I think if we just look at the two paragraphs in bold, it refers to a publication by the APPG, which I'll come on to, and a backbench debate. And then we can see the Haemophilia Society setting out their belief that the current system of support provided by those 5 organisations there listed was not fit for purpose, belief that they should be disbanded. And then the second matter there set out is a formal public apology. And then before I ask you about that, if I can show you one other document, which is MACF 5022_027. This is also from February 2015. And we can see, and I don't need to go in, I think, to the detail of it, but we can see from the middle of the page, it refers to MPs calling for government inquiry into the Macfarlane Trust after the Haemophilia Society loses confidence. It refers to the letter that we've just looked at in the first paragraph, and then sets out a view that the government should announce that the system of trusts requires urgent review with no option for reform or change off the agenda. And then we can see the signatories include Alistair Burt and the chairs of the APPG on haemophilia and also Jenny Willett MP. Now, having regard to the sequence of events there described, the APPG report, those communications, the press release here from Alistair Burt, would it be fair to say that certainly by early 2015, the department would have been under no illusion that there was a significant amount of concern about and criticism of the existing financial support schemes?
Correct.
And you, I think, have recollections of this being an issue that Alistair Burt in particular was concerned about.
He campaigned very hard on it.
You refer in your statement, if we just go to WITN 3499001, and if we go to page 29, bottom of the page, you refer to Alistair Burt talking to you persuasively and with characteristic compassion about this issue. And if we go over the page, you talk there about, again, awareness of the anger and disappointment of campaigners. And then in the penultimate sentence of that paragraph, you say, I'm sure that his views, so Mr. Burt's, would have contributed to my sense that the status quo was not acceptable, fair or just. And when you're talking about the status quo there, is that specifically in relation to the financial support schemes?
I think it's the whole thing.
So if I can then explore with you, Mr. Hunt, some documents relating to various submissions presented to ministers, not always to you, quite often to the junior minister, looking at the ways in which the financial support schemes could be reorganised or changed and the payments altered. Now, I'm not going to, for the most part, look at the details of the individual options that were under consideration at any particular time. I just want to get a sense of the chronology of events and how this was coming across the desk of ministers. So we can, I think, pick it up in 2013 at WITN 3499009. This is a document described as options for review of the contaminated blood payment schemes, and it refers to an anticipated discussion on the 10th of May 2013. And we can, I think, just look at the top of the second page. Under the heading Purpose of this paper, during PSPH's attendance at the APPG on haemophilia and contaminated blood on the 17th of April 2013, she expressed dissatisfaction with the current system of financial support and has asked us to meet her. This paper sets out our thinking so far on a broad range of possible options for reforming the hepatitis C payment system so that it better addresses the needs of those affected, and so on. And then the third paragraph, however, there's no easy solution to this. All the options we identify are likely to cost significantly more than the current payments system. And if we go to page 6, there's a range of options set out. As I say, I'm not proposing to take you through the detail of them. But it would be right, I think, to understand from this that the question of reorganisation of the schemes, dealing with some of the concerns, disparities, perceived injustices, was on the agenda, if I can put it that way, of the Department of Health in the way we see here.
Correct.
If we then go to a submission a little later in 2013, July 2013, WITN 3499010. It's a submission from Ben Cole. It's dated the 11th of July 2013, and we can see it's addressed both to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Public Health and to you. And then the first paragraph says, following your 15th of May meeting with officials to discuss the HIV and hepatitis C contaminated blood payment scheme, you requested advice on replacing the current system with a no-fault quantum damages-based compensation scheme. You also asked for advice on a tariff-based system. Since then, Secretary of State has also asked for advice on a system of equal-sized annual payments for all infected people, rising incrementally to £25,000 per annum. This submission sets out our preliminary assessment of these options to date. Now, just pausing there, this would indicate that you yourself had some direct involvement with this issue by this time.
Yes, I wouldn't imagine it was a very deep involvement, but obviously, conversations were had, but I think I would have probably taken the view that this was something that I wanted the Minister to look at in more detail and come back with her concrete recommendations. And
just to put it in context, at this point in time, the Minister is still Anna Soubry, as I understand it. And then we've got the recommendation in this submission, which is to consider and agree success criteria identified at paragraph 5, consider the options against the success criteria and within the overall funding envelope available, advise on whether you wish us to work up further detail, and then note that as hepatitis C payments, but not HIV payments, which DH historically provides, are funded by all 4 UK administrations, you therefore write to the health ministers of the devolved administrations to agree a UK-wide approach to any further work. And then if we go over the page, just to understand those recommendations, paragraph 5 are the success criteria. Cost, acceptability to affected individuals, extent to which it addresses the spectrum of ill health and or need of those affected, extent to which it minimises payments to people experiencing few or no ill health effects or have little or no need, and extent to which it can respond to changes in a person's state of health. And then we've got the heading options and costs, and there are 3 options in paragraph 6. So the submission says, we've worked up a preliminary analysis of 3 options for change. Again, I'm not going to go through the detail of those options, but we can see them there set out. So equal annual payments for all infected individuals, a quantum-based system and a tariff-based system, and those are further evaluated within the document. And then just in terms of financing, if we go to the bottom of the page, it says options 1 and 2 are unaffordable within DH budgets to the end of 2015-16. A business case could be made to Treasury if ministers wanted to pursue these options, but within the context of recent spending round discussions and the wider picture on government-wide financing, it seems unlikely that HMT would grant any request for additional funding. Excuse me. And then paragraph 10, option 3 could potentially be funded from within existing DH budgets, but further work would need to be done to determine detailed costings. And then it explains that if there were higher costs in the longer term, then HMT agreement would be needed. As I understand it, but there wasn't an approach to the Treasury at this point in time so this is still 2013, for additional funding for any of these options. Is that right?
I don't think there were any formal approaches, but I think there were conversations with Treasury ministers in which it was made very clear to me that the Ireland option, which I was, I think, aware certainly by 2014, was the one that was most likely to be favoured by campaigners, but would require additional funding from the Treasury, was not going to be acceptable to the government, and that I wouldn't get anywhere with that because that would need money outside my own budget. So I was aware of that from verbal conversations rather than from any written letter requesting it.
So that's July 2013. If we move on to September 2013, WITN 3499011. This is a submission 13th of September. Again, it's addressed both to the Minister and to you. And we can see from the title it's providing further advice. At purpose, you are considering options for additional financial support for those affected by HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood before 1991. And then there's reference to the submission we just looked at. This submission provides advice on what options might be affordable within current DH budgets for the remainder of this SR, the spending review period, and our assessment of those options, and seeks your views on next steps. And then if we go over the page, there's a discussion of the options beginning under the heading Consideration of Options. I'm not going to read through the detail of them, but we can see 3 options there set out. So we have option 1, and then option 1 was an increase in the existing annual payments. Option 2, introducing targeted new regular payments. And then next page, option 3, increasing discretionary funding. So it would appear that these were options looking at how things could be altered within the existing funding envelope. And then paragraph 14 acknowledges none of these options will completely satisfy the campaign groups. Now, again, it doesn't look as though any decision in response to the submission was taken at this stage. And you observe in your statement that shortly after this that Anna Soubry was replaced by Jane Ellison. Are you able to assist us in understanding why there doesn't appear to be any particular responses to these various submissions that we see?
I don't recall seeing that particular submission. I suspect that I was waiting for a recommendation from Anna Soubry as to what she thought the best way forward was and what it would cost. And so when Jane Ellison came, she then engaged with the issue and brought Mike Doricott to come and see me. And so my guess is that that's what I was doing as Secretary of State.
And then we can see if we go to a submission from December 2013 that there'd certainly been meetings taking place. So if we go to WITN 3499012, this is another document from Ben Cole. This is dated the 2nd of December 2013, addressed to the Minister and to you. And paragraph 1 says, this submission responds to your request at our meeting on the 16th of October 2013 for advice on a range of options for measures that could be introduced to improve the system of ex gratia financial support for those affected. And in addition, outlines possible models for an inquiry, and I'll pick up the question of a public inquiry later. And then we can see paragraph 2 refers to a meeting on the 14th of November 2013 with Alistair Burt and campaigners, and it would seem the Prime Minister, because it records there the Prime Minister saying there were issues regarding the system of financial support which should be looked at again. Do you know whether you were present at either of those meetings?
I don't believe I was. And I think probably just to sort of explain how the department works, that submission would have been for the junior minister. This submission responds to your request at our meeting on the 16th of October. I would imagine that was the junior minister who made that request. And by sending it to me as well, that would have meant that it went to my private office, where there would have been an official responsible for this area who would have read it and basically just kept a broad eye on it, and it would have been the way the civil service was trying to make sure that the actions taken by junior ministers weren't falling out of line with what the Secretary of State is likely to want.
And we've heard from earlier ministers giving evidence that there are effectively ordinarily 2 stages before something might reach the actual Secretary of State, or indeed another minister. The officials have to decide that this is something that needs to come to a minister's attention, and they will then prepare a submission that goes to the private office. But then there is a second filter effectively applied in the private office. in which a judgment is made by the officials within the private office as to whether that is a document which will go addressed to the Minister, whether that actually needs to be seen by the Minister. Is that right?
Correct.
So again, I'm not going to read through this document. Part of the process is so that others can understand the dates upon which matters were being considered. But there is a further discussion in this document about options for improving financial support available. If we then pick matters up in the beginning of 2014 at WITN 3499013, so this is Ben Cole, 31st of January 2014, again to the same recipients, but you explain in your statement that not necessarily a document that you saw. Paragraph 1 explains that the purpose was to provide indicative cost estimates for potential scenarios. And then paragraph 2 says this: our analysis shows that the upfront costs of such a change could be anywhere between 61 million to 410 million. And then the second sentence says such high upfront costs or increases in the annual allocation for the scheme could not be met from existing budgets. In the absence of additional money and given the severe pressure on central budgets, we will need to consider what might be done to reform the current system to address the key concerns of campaigners and MPs within the current or lower budget envelope of the system. So is it right to understand that this is looking here at this point in time at a situation in which there'll be no additional funding, and indeed it might be that there is less spent, but that it's provided in a different way?
Well, that's what the document says. As I say, I don't think I would have seen this document, but I think what the system will have been doing at that point is saying there's a lot of people who are very unhappy with what's happening. Is there a way that we can improve the administration of the 5 AHOs, which doesn't cost the taxpayer any additional funds, but is an improvement in administration and efficiency and responsiveness? And maybe at least we can help by doing that. I think that my view at the time would have been that would have been probably a bit of a fool's errand, because part of the dissatisfaction with the AHOs was that they weren't distributing as much cash as people needed. And so, as we saw the next year, we did, when we started to look into reform, put small extra sums of money behind it. But I think what officials would have been doing here is saying, okay, we've got your steer that, the Department of Health, not only can we certainly not afford the sort of 1 billion plus cost of the Irish scheme, and the Treasury said they're not willing to fund that, but actually we were pretty desperate for extra money inside the Department of Health itself because of the pressures on the NHS front line. And so they would have been looking to see what they could do within the current financial envelopes.
And if I can just pick up a couple of further paragraphs in this document. So the bottom of this page gives us the DH perspective on the schemes at that point in time. The system is ex gratia in nature because all payments are made without any finding of fault or liability for negligence or any other wrongdoing on the part of DH. Sorry, I'm looking at paragraph 5, bottom of the page, I should have said.
Yeah.
Although never described by DH as compensation, the system is clearly compensatory in nature. Some payments appear to be made in recognition of the fact of infection, while others provide ongoing support or to compensate for loss. Payment levels are, for the most part, arbitrary and, with some exceptions, not based on any assessment of impact or need. As a result, there is scope for establishing a more coherent and rational basis for the system, which would serve as the basis for more effective targeting of spending. And based on your own knowledge over the years you were Secretary of State, would you agree with that description, payment levels being for the most part arbitrary and with some exceptions not based on any assessment of impact or need?
I would describe it like that on the basis of what I know now. At the time, I think I would have just been aware of dissatisfaction with the way the AHOs were working from the people who depended on them, and a broader worry I had that to properly resolve this issue, we didn't have the finances at hand to be able to do so.
And just to pick up that issue in relation to finances, the bottom of page 3 of this document, please, Lawrence. We have a heading Finance, and then paragraph 12 says, Secretary of State has asked DH Finance to undertake a zero-based review of all central programme budgets in 2015-16 in order to release savings to the front line. That, I think, picks up on something you said a few minutes ago about the way in which the department was looking to reallocate monies within its budget. Is that right? Yes.
I mean, to give you an idea of the context, what a typical year would have been like in 2014. The situation deteriorated very dramatically in 2014. So 2012, when I arrived, in 2013, we were relatively able to make ends meet. But by the time it was getting to 2014 and 2015, we would start the year with a gap in our budget. We knew we were going to have to spend X, and we only had Y, and the gap would be, I think you've seen the phrase referred to as it would be called a pressure. It was a kind of a euphemism really for an overdraft, money that we didn't have, we knew we were going to have to find. And then basically you would spend the year, I have to say brilliant people in the Department of Health Finance team would spend the year trying to juggle the books so that we reduce the gap to zero. So let's say the gap started at £2 billion. By the end of the year, they would gradually get that down to zero by, for example, pushing a capital project to the next year, or seeing a bill that could be pushed to the right. You know, there was constantly hanging over our shoulders was the fact that there was unfunded pressure that was going to have to be found during the year. So that's why, and central programme budgets, which were not huge, but they were the only budgets that I directly controlled. The money that went to the NHS was ring-fenced. That was the vast majority of the budget. But even the money that was left behind, a lot of it was effectively ring-fenced because it was going for training of doctors or sexual health services or things like that, which were effectively frontline services as well.
And then the last sentence of that paragraph, I think, tells us the position of DH Finance. The view of DH Finance is that we should assess options for reforming the current system with an existing or lower budget envelope, ensuring value for money. So that's January 2014. I think if we go through to May 2014, we get to WITN 3499014, please. This is 30th of May 2014. This is now addressed only to the junior minister, although it's said to be copied to all other ministers and to special advisors. And it's an update. We see that from the title and paragraph 1, to provide you as requested with an update on the work on the possible restructuring and retargeting of the contaminated blood ex gratia payment schemes into a single simplified scheme for all infected by HIV and or hepatitis C through treatment with NHS supplied blood or blood products. And I don't propose to go through the detail of it, but it refers to having received advice about how the existing schemes could be dismantled and how potentially a new structure could be created. Now, it's in the middle of 2014, as I understand it, that the Prime Minister indicated that there could be an additional £25 million made available as a one-off sum. And if we just look at a document relating to that, and then I want to ask you a bit more about that. WITN 3499015. This is an email dated the 3rd of June 2014, and it's from, I think, Will Jones is your private office. And then it says, the PM has responded and we have a bit of clarity on the direction of travel. The PM would like an additional £25 million added as a one-off sum from DH DH should set out how we think the money should be used. The PM agreed to a review and streamlining the system of financial support. The PM agreed that the Secretary of State should express regret to the individuals who've become infected. This includes publishing the DH documents relating to the infections early. And then there's a sentence that's incomplete. I don't know why. What's your recollection of how the decision was reached in relation to this £25 million? It was not formally announced until the following year, but just in terms of the decision-making in the middle of 2014.
So I'm not sure quite how we got to that point. I think it's entirely possible that it was a suggestion from me that we find £25 million. To give you an idea of context, and this might surprise some people, but in the sort of 115 odd billion pounds budget, I had an informal understanding with the Department of Health Finance team that I would have a discretionary £50 million a year that I could use for emergencies or things that came up during the year. That was £50 million that was effectively an unfunded pressure, to use their language, but we agreed that in the current financial context there was a need sometimes for a Secretary of State to be able to spend a bit of money to solve a problem. And so, as I say, I suspect what happened is that there were discussions with number 10, probably not directly with the Prime Minister, but with the Prime Minister's health advisor, about what are you willing to do about the concerns that campaign groups have about the way the AHOs are functioning. We would have explained that to address their concerns was ultimately going to be a multi-billion pound issue, which the Treasury said they weren't willing to fund. We would have said, as the Department of Health, the most we can afford as an interim measure is £25 million, which would have been half the total allocation that I would have had, and that we were willing to do that as a temporary measure. And then there would have been a discussion, I suspect, again, not with the Prime Minister, but with the Prime Minister's health advisor. And on the basis of that, Will Jones would have written this note. And
I think you tell us, you describe in your statement it as a contingency pot, this £50 million that you held. Is it fair to say that the £25 million was, in a sense, an arbitrary figure? It recognised money that you could lay your hands on, rather than being a figure that was identified as a solution to the problem?
That is absolutely correct. I mean, we were scrabbling around for money, and I think at this time we were waiting for the Penrose report to come out. I think we had an expectation, as I think campaigners did, that it would be much more substantive than it actually ended up being, and so we thought we were likely to have to properly address the issue then, and that was going to be my moment when I would go to the Treasury and say, we really do need to find some extra money for this. So I was thinking, what can we do to get us to the point where Penrose is published, given that people need extra support now? So I think I would have said, okay, well, I will, but just to be absolutely clear, this was not an official pot of money. It was not written down anywhere. It was an informal understanding between me and my finance director at the Department of Health that there was occasionally going to be need for things like this, and that was so. Yes, I think we thought, well, okay, this is a serious issue. We'll allocate half of our contingency pot to this.
And we don't need to go to it, but there's a submission dated the 8th of July 2014. I'm going to just read the reference into the transcript for the record. It's WITN 3499016, and it provides advice on options for the spending of that £25 million. If we come forward then a little to October 2014, again, just to follow it through chronologically, Lawrence, could we have WITN 3499017? this is, as we see from the bottom of the page, dated the 29th of October 2014. We can see from the heading, Business Case for DH Policy Proposal, Reform of the System of Ex Gratia Financial Assistance for People Infected pre-91 with HIV and or Hepatitis C, and so on. And then the first paragraph explains that the department proposes to consult on reforming the system. 4 lines in, it describes the current system as complex and with a number of shortcomings. And then the last sentence of that paragraph says, DH therefore proposes to reform the system so that it's more rational, fair and flexible. And then paragraph 2 says, in order to achieve this, some redistribution of resources would be required. And consequently, this proposal will be contentious for those who see a reduction in or end to the payments they receive under the current system. So what was being looked at is this right at this point in time as a possible route, subject to consultation, was reorganising. Again, the expectation was within the existing budget envelope, the way in which the system was both structured and the nature of the payments that were made, which might result in some who were currently receiving payments no longer receiving those payments.
Well, this is why it was a nonsense way forward, because, you know, in a context of people having suffered an injustice where everyone was not getting the sums of money that they needed or should have been entitled to, it was a dead end to think that one way we could address this issue was by reorganising the schemes that existed, if that meant that we were going to be cutting payments to some people who, given that, you know, no one was getting what they deserved.
And I don't need to go through the detail of it, but again, for the benefit of those listening, paragraph 9 on the next page identified that this would be a contentious policy change with a significant risk of legal challenge attached to it, particularly from those who might receive less under the new system.
So we didn't actually pursue that.
No.
So I think it was understood that even though that was advice, it wasn't good advice.
Now, there was a draft consultation document, however, building on this, that was produced. I'm not going to go to it because it wasn't the consultation document that was ultimately issued. But again, for the benefit of anyone wanting to follow the detailed chronology, the draft consultation document is dated November 2014 and is WITN 3499018. And that was sent to Jane Ellison in November 2014. And again, the reference for that is WITN 3499019. Can I, at this point, pick up the narrative in your statement, Mr. Hunt? So if we could have on screen, Lawrence, WITN 3499001, and go to page 43, please. So we can see in paragraph 33.17 of your statement, you refer to the draft consultation document and the submission being sent to Jane Ellison. That's the document I've just referred to. And then you say the hope was that the 12-week consultation process could be completed before the general election of the 7th of May 2015. In the event, the consultation process was delayed, possibly out of a desire to wait for the Penrose Inquiry report, which was expected to comment on issues of financial support, as well as the need to study the work that had been published by the APPG on the 14th of January 2015. So it sounds from that as though the reason this didn't go ahead was not because of a departmental acknowledgement that it was nonsense, but because other things were going on in the background that might affect the position. Is that right?
I'm not quite sure when the £25 million was agreed. But if this was after the £25 million, I think this might have been after the £25 million was agreed. What I was saying was nonsense, was the idea that you could reorganise the scheme without putting any extra money into it, because then, although you might make it more logical, you would have people losing out, and that would be very unfair. So that was what I was referring to as nonsense.
And in terms of that 25 million, my understanding is, from your statement and the documents, is that it was agreed between you and the Prime Minister, or at official level, whatever it might be, in the middle of 2014, but it was not announced until March 2015, and we'll come on to the announcement. So that takes us to the end of 2014. At the beginning of 2015, we have, as alluded to in your statement, the publication by the APPG of its report. If we just briefly go to that, it's RLIT 5031. And we see there the description of the report and the date January 2015. Now, I'm not going to ask you about the detail of it, Mr. Hunt. The inquiry's looked at this report with other witnesses in earlier hearings. But as I understand it from your statement, you don't expect that you would have read this report. You would expect that that was a matter being dealt with by Jane Ellison.
Correct, although I may well have read summaries of it in the media, and I'm sure I was aware of it.
So we then get to March 2015. 25th of March was the publication of the Penrose report. You've alluded already to the fact that the department, might be putting it too strongly to say, had an expectation that the report might be more far-reaching in its recommendations than it was. Do you recall what your response was, or the department's reaction was, when the Penrose report was finally produced?
I think we thought it was a bit of a damp squib, but I don't think we thought that was necessarily a good thing. If the Penrose report had come up with some specific recommendations for Scotland, that would have meant that I could have gone to the Treasury and said, this is what we should do in England, we need you to give us the extra resources to do it. And it would have been a lever that would have allowed me to do that, and quite possibly I would have had the support of number 10 in that situation. So I think from a departmental point of view, as someone who was aware that there was an issue here that needed to be resolved, it meant that I didn't have that lever that I was hoping might have been there.
We can see from your statement, so if we put the statement back on screen, please, Lawrence, WITN 3499001, and the same page again, page 43, we'll see the Prime Minister's announcement in response to, or on the same day as the publication, so bottom of the page, it says, on the same day, the Prime Minister offered an apology for what had happened and announced the additional £25 million of funds. And then you've set out the text of the Prime Minister's announcement. My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this with the Penrose report being published today. I can do all of the three things he asks for. I know that many members on all sides of this House have raised the question of infected blood, and I've spoken about how constituents have been to my surgeries. While it would be for the next government to take account of these findings, it is right that we use this moment to recognise the pain and the suffering experienced by people as a result of this tragedy. It is difficult to imagine the feelings of unfairness that people must feel at being infected with something like hepatitis C or HIV as a result of a totally unrelated treatment within the NHS. To each and every one of those people, I would like to say sorry on behalf of the government for something that should not have happened. No amount of money can ever fully make up for what did happen, but it is vital that we move as soon as possible to improve the way that payments are made to those infected by this blood. I can confirm today that the government will provide up to £25 million in 2015-16 to support any transitional arrangements to a better payment system. I commit that if I'm Prime Minister in May, we will respond to the findings of this report as a matter of priority. And just to understand the significance of the dates, that's the 25th of March. Parliament was dissolved on the 30th of March, and a general election held on the 7th of May 2015.
Correct.
And so is it right to understand, in accordance with the general conventions, that in that intervening period you would not expect to be making significant policy announcements until the election had taken place?
Correct, and also the right place for those policy announcements to be made would be Parliament, and Parliament was dissolved for the general election.
Can we just look at the written ministerial statement that you issued on the day that the Penrose Inquiry report was published? So that's at MACF 5022_045. We can see it's written statement made by you, 25th of March 2015. In the last sentence of the first paragraph, you echo what the Prime Minister had said. I would like to say on behalf of this government how sorry we are for what's happened and express my sympathy for the pain and grief suffered by many infected people and their families. And then in the next paragraph, you refer to the support schemes, and you say in the second sentence, the system has evolved in an ad hoc and incremental manner, now comprising 5 infection-focused schemes that operate according to their own individual criteria. You refer to there having been improvements, and then you say that despite these improvements, there have been continued criticisms of the system, and then there's a reference to the, amongst other things, the APPG report. And then if we pick it up in the fourth paragraph, beginning, I thank both the on member, you say in the second sentence, it's with frustration and sincere regret that our considerations on the design of a future system have been subject to postponement while we awaited publication of Lord Penrose's final report of his inquiry in Scotland. We had hoped to consult during this Parliament on reforming the ex gratia financial assistance schemes, considering amongst other options a system based on some form of individual assessment. However, I felt it was important to consider fully Lord Penrose's report before any such consultation. Given its publication today, we clearly are not in a position to launch a consultation on one of the last sitting days of this Parliament. And then in the next paragraph, second sentence, you say, whilst it will be for the next government to consider all of Lord Penrose's findings, I would hope and fully expect proposals for improving the current complex payment system to be brought forward with other UK health departments. And then there is a reference to, again, to the £25 million. So we know, obviously, that the government was re-elected. You remained Secretary of State for Health. So I want to pick matters up next in June, post-election, so June 2015. But before we look at any further documents, the one recommendation that had been made by the Penrose Inquiry report was a recommendation in relation to offering testing for hepatitis C to those who'd had transfusion. Was any work undertaken by the Department of Health, to your knowledge, to consider the applicability of that recommendation to England?
I don't know. My understanding from the documents I've read preparing for this session is that the Department of Health's view was that testing had happened and that therefore it wasn't necessary to do further testing in England, but I only know that from what I've read in preparation for today.
So if we then pick matters up in June, WITN 3499020, this is a submission dated the 1st of June 2015. It is, we don't need to go to it, but page 6 gives us the list of those to whom it's copied, and it includes your private office. It's copied to Mr. Jones. But we can see it's addressed to the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Public Health. And the issue is identified in the first paragraph is, as requested, this submission sets out options and estimates for using extra money over and above the additional £25 million already allocated in 2015-16. And then the last sentence of that paragraph says this would be contingent upon additional money being agreed by HMT and cannot be met from within existing DH budgets. Paragraph 2 says Secretary of State has asked you to recommend a way forward on this issue. So is it right to understand from that that there must have been some dialogue or interaction between you and your minister?
Yes.
And then paragraph 3 sets out how a proposal to HMT could be formulated. I think at this stage I need to go through the detail of the options, because again, the options change, I think to some extent from document to document. But I want to pick it up with a letter that you wrote then at the end of this month to the Prime Minister. So that's at CABO 40163_003. It's a letter dated the 30th of June 2015 from you to Mr Cameron, and we can see it's headed, if we go further down the page, Lawrence, response to the Penrose report, and you say this: as you know, this is an incredibly difficult issue where we are committed to giving a full government response by the end of July. It is basically impossible to bridge the gap between the expectations of families who have suffered and are expecting a settlement exceeding £1 billion and what we can realistically afford. Time is also pressing as we currently face litigation from 3 hepatitis C sufferers or former sufferers who are making the case that the current arrangements favour HIV sufferers over those with Hep C. Legal advice is that some are likely to succeed, and if the DH were ordered to recompense them, we would face a multi-million-pound liability for compensation for them and others in similar circumstances. After considerable thought, I'm writing to set out what I believe our options are. And then we have 3 options set out, and I just want to read parts of this because this is obviously a point at which you are directly involved in the decision-making process. So the first option is what you've described as the austerity option, £25 million. This option sticks to the £25 million we promised before the election, with no additional resources allocated for lump sum buyouts from the existing scheme or accelerated treatment for those with hepatitis C. And then there's reference to the current scheme being reformed. You pick up in the next paragraph on the criticisms of the system and say this: the current system has been widely criticised by those affected by infected blood due to its confusing structure, discretionary charitable payments and outdated funding structure that apportions money to some who are ostensibly well and little to many who are ill. We would reform the system from 5 funds to one single one, which will allocate money on the basis of impact of infection on each person's health. We would also remind GPs of the issue of infected blood and their responsibility to offer HCV testing to those at risk in accordance with Lord Penrose's recommendation. Then we could use the additional £25 million to offer final payments to buy bereaved spouses and partners out of the existing scheme. Currently, only about 10% of spouses receive regular payments, but under this proposal, subject to views following consultation, all surviving bereaved spouses would receive a payment of around £20,000 to exit the scheme. Around 90% of bereaved families currently get nothing, so they would benefit, but campaigners would be furious and consider it a slap in the face. If I can just ask you about something in that second paragraph on the page. You talk about the system apportioning money to some who are ostensibly well and little to many who are ill. Don't need to ask you, I think, about the reference to little to many who are ill, because that, I think, is well understood. But why was it thought by the department that the current systems were giving money to those who were ostensibly well?
I suspect that is compensation to families who've lost loved ones, rather than payments to support people who are currently ill.
In any event, that's our first option that the department puts forward. And then the second option, 2, is minimum scheme likely to satisfy majority of sufferers. And this would cost, is this right, an additional £480 million? Is that how we should read this?
Correct.
And then you say this: given the expectations set by the generous settlement made in Ireland for similar issues up to £1 million for each family, it will be impossible to satisfy all families affected by this tragedy. but I believe the following scheme would satisfy the majority of such families. Payments will be offered not just to bereaved families but to existing sufferers in order to buy them out of the scheme. Payments would be around £50,000 per bereaved family and up to £100,000 per infected person. This option would close down the payment schemes, so whilst payment would need to be tapered over the next 5 years, after this point, no further funding would be needed. And then top of the next page, additionally, a new hepatitis C treatment which can clear the infection has recently become available. The NHS has introduced an accelerated treatment programme for those with greatest clinical need. Only around 800 of the infected blood cohort are eligible, leaving 2,500 with no early access to the new treatment. Under this option, all 2,500 would get accelerated access. This would be funded by us paying for private treatment, as we would not be able to use NHS funds to allow them to jump the queue ahead of other NHS patients in greater clinical need. There is a risk in this option that it would create a precedent for the DH to be lobbied for funding treatments that NHS England does not currently provide, but I believe this is manageable given the exceptional historical circumstances. However, although we are making progress in identifying £22 billion savings to the health budget, we have not completed this process, so this option is not currently affordable for DH and would have to be funded by additional resources from the centre. So just to understand that second option, Mr Hunt, it would require additional funding, £480 million, but the proposal, is this right, was twofold. It envisaged essentially the winding down of the schemes completely and one-off payments to as it puts it, to buy people out of the scheme.
Correct.
And they're not...
And a treatment option.
And yes, I'll come to the treatment option. In terms of the payments, they're not very generous payments, are they?
Well, I was making a judgment here, and it's a judgment that I fully accept people might disagree with, but I was writing a letter to the Prime Minister in which I was trying to explain to him that, you know, given I've been told in no uncertain terms that there was no possibility whatsoever of the Treasury finding the £1 billion plus that would have been necessary for an Irish scheme, if that was off the table, what might potentially satisfy people as being not as generous as Ireland, but doing a great deal more than we were currently doing. And I fully accept that it's contentious as to whether that would have actually satisfied people. As Health Secretary, I personally had a priority to try and get treatment to as many people who were ill as quickly as possible. And there was this issue that the way the NHS, for very understandable reasons, prioritises treatment is on the basis of clinical need. So the people who didn't have the greatest clinical need, well, only 800 people would have got treatment early, so got treatment automatically from the NHS. And I felt it was wrong that there were 1,700 people who, as a result of failings by the state, had an infection that was life-changing. And so I wanted to allocate some of the resources to that.
And then the third option is described as maximum possible within DH budget constraints, £125 million. And you say this: if we did not want to proceed with the austerity option one, I've looked at what could potentially be done within the very stretched existing DH budget. The advice I'm being given is that very little is available. Furthermore, I'm clear if we were to find additional resources, it would take us longer to identify the £22 billion savings, and perhaps most significantly harder to balance our books in the next 2 years when pressures will be particularly acute. However, I'm also aware of the need to do the maximum we possibly can to bring closure to a terrible tragedy that affected around 4,600 people, for which they and their families have suffered immeasurably. So with the agreement of yourself and the Chancellor, I would be prepared to absorb an additional £100 million pressure in the DH budget to fund accelerated access to the new Hep C treatment for all those in the early stage of the disease. This would come from DH funds and would not be funded to the NHS England mandate. Indeed, would be most likely to be provided privately. This additional £100 million would be on top of the ongoing costs of the payment schemes. So just pausing there again to understand option 3, this is on the basis that the schemes will continue essentially at the same, with the same level of funding that they currently had. leaving aside the £25 million that had already been found from the contingencies pot. And within the existing DH budget, there would be a further £100 million. And your proposal in option 3 was that that could be used for accelerated access to the new hepatitis C treatments.
Yes, let's be clear. The extra £100 million was a number that I plucked out of the air. There wasn't any logic to it in terms of the scale of the need, but because the spending review was going to take a further couple of years, it was £50 million. It was the pot that I had available for both the following 2 years, used up in its entirety for this. And I thought it would be something, not remotely satisfactory, but I thought it would be something. But I had a suspicion that the Treasury were going to say that they weren't prepared to find anything for this, so everything had to come from the Department of Health. So this was the maximum that I judged that we could afford.
And at the bottom of the page, you say we should be clear that this option would not satisfy campaigners. So on that basis, you may decide to go for option 1 anyway. But my own view is that notwithstanding that it is probably the fairest option to go for given current financial constraints. Go on to say something about a public inquiry, but I'll come back to that later. So of 3 options, all of which were, is this fair to say, imperfect in different respects, the least imperfect in your view was option 3?
Well, no, my preferred option was not option 3. My preferred option was option 2, but it been made very clear to me as Health Secretary that I would have to fund in its entirety any costs with any option, and we would have had to therefore take that 480 million from the NHS's frontline services budget, which I didn't think would be right. So that's why I say given current financial constraints, that's in a way a code for saying given what the Treasury is willing to fund on top of my budget, then I think option 3 is what we're left with.
I see. And then I just want to look now at some documents emanating from number 10 in relation to this issue, which, as I understand it, you would not have seen at the time. So although some of what was being said would be fed back to you or your private office, the documents themselves are not documents that you would expect to have seen. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
So we can start by CABO 40163_002. And we can see it's from Claire MacDonald, 5th of July 2015 to the Prime Minister. I'll come back to the handwritten entry in a moment. Let's just look at the text. So it explains that you have written to the Prime Minister to outline the proposed next steps to reform the system of support. And it describes you as having outlined 3 potential options for moving forwards with this, which we've committed to do before recess. The next paragraph refers to the announcement in March of the 25 million. It refers to campaigners having highlighted the fragmented and inconsistent payment system of support. We agreed that we should look to consolidate and reform these systems of support. And recently at PMQs, you committed to a full government statement in response to the Penrose report. There's then reference to the negative response from campaigners to the Penrose report. There's reference to the one recommendation, and it said that will be accepted and implemented. And then there's reference again to you writing to the Prime Minister. And if we go over the page, we can see in the second paragraph it says the downside is that in order to keep the overall costs of the scheme in check, the consultation also proposes withdrawing support from uninfected family members, such as widows of those who've died following infection. This change would be a natural consequence of prioritising based on clinical need, but will generate substantial opposition. The Scottish Government have made clear that they will not join any consultation where someone might lose as a result, but we expect a long delay before they put forward on alternative plans. And that, as I understand it, picks up on that earlier consultation document that we looked briefly at from the end of 2014. And then there's a summary of your 3 options.
In a different order.
In a different order, yes. Hence my confusion, I think, earlier when I asked you a question. And it says Jeremy Hunt favours option 3, which was option 2 in your letter, which he thinks is fairest and will close down the issue for future years.
Yes, I think my letter did not say it would close down the issue for future years. I think that's a false inference from my letter.
And then we can see the number 10 view. Our view is that we should proceed with option 1, so that's the austerity option, the 25 million already announced and nothing further, which is the only option we feel is realistic in the 15-16 spending environment. HMT will not agree to a further 100 million from DH underspends when hospital providers are running deficits. The Hep C drug will eventually be available, I think there should be the word 2 there, everyone. As NICE has improved it, but it's being rolled out in a staged way. Jeremy's final option of additional money from HMT is clearly not feasible on top of the 8 billion of extra funding already agreed for the NHS. And then the question that's posed for the Prime Minister, are you content to proceed with option 1, publishing a consultation before recess with the intention of using the 25 million to give lump sum payments to surviving bereaved spouses of those infected? So we can see Mr Cameron's response to that question is no. If we go up the page, in relation to the second paragraph and the idea that support would be withdrawn from those who already received it, his comment is no, this will not work. And then if we just go to the first page and just look at the handwriting there, I think I can read most of it. So, sorry, I don't think these work. A scheme that is meant to help but actually takes money away from people who currently get it is hopeless. And I accept we don't have 480 million lying around. Surely there is a route where we increase the 25 million to 100 million or some such to fill in the worst payment gaps and merge all the charities into one, which I think is ultimately is effectively essentially what happened.
Yes.
Do you agree with the characterisation by the Prime Minister of the idea of taking money away from people who currently get it is hopeless?
Well, he took a political judgment. He may well have been right. I took a slightly different judgment because within the 125 million, I wanted to prioritise treatment and make sure that everyone who had Hep C got treatment really quickly. So we made a different judgment in that situation. I understand why he made the judgment he made, and I think he is right that there would have been a lot of opposition from the families that didn't get the compensation that they were expecting. So, you know, for me, the important thing about this response was that he understood that it would be harsh beyond belief to stick with the 25 million and that we should, as a very minimum, do the 100 million. It was also clear that he agreed the national finances couldn't find the 480 million, which obviously from a Health Secretary's point of view would have been what I would have hoped would have happened, but those were the constraints that I was operating under.
And if we go to WITN 3499021, we can pick up the communication of this from number 10 back to your office. So if we go to the second page, we can see in the main part of the page an email from Will Jones, so your private secretary, 6th of July 2015, and it says the PM's looked at the Secretary of State's note on contaminated blood and the proposed consultation over the weekend and has asked for a radical change in direction. And then we have the 4 bullet points. A very clear steer that he's not prepared to consult on or implement a scheme that removes money from groups that currently receive it. Not feasible to spend an extra 480 million or request additional funding from central reserves. Minded to progress with reform of the charities, but effectively level up the payments with and we can see an expectation that the DH would meet that cost, and then no interest in pursuing the option of accelerated hepatitis C treatment, so we can discount this option for now. And then if we go to the first page, there's a concern expressed in the middle of the page. I don't know whether this is from DH Finance. Oh, yes, it is. It's from the Director of Group Financial Management at Department of Health, saying, I'm still left with the question on how this can be funded. given we've no resources to meet these costs internally beyond the one-off £25 million in for 2015-16. So that I think then, in terms of July, takes us to one further document. Yes, it's a further document from the Prime Minister, CABO 40164_002. So this is a submission a week or so later, again from Claire MacDonald, dated the 13th of July, to the Prime Minister. Again, we'll come back to the handwriting. It says, you asked for a different approach to the consultation on reform of support schemes, and it refers to the consultation having been redrafted. And then in the third paragraph, it says, to meet your request, but also stick to the timetable you committed to at PMQs, the consultation has been redrafted to make it entirely open as to the best way forwards, rather than specifying a preferred government position. This delays decisions on funding for the new scheme until the consultation is complete. There's no longer any reference in the consultation to withdrawing support from certain groups, and the consultation clearly states it's our intention in reforming these schemes that anyone currently receiving support will continue to do so in a reformed scheme. And then over the page, there's a question about who should announce this, and the answer there is given is, in terms of whether the Prime Minister announced it, no. And then the consultation is likely to raise expectations of significant additional payments. You initially committed 25 million of additional funding for new payments, but this was a one-off amount rather than recurrent funding. And the next paragraph then says, we'll work with the Department of Health and HMT to a spending review timetable to consider the affordability, I think the word of is missing, the new scheme, and we'll come back to you with further advice. And then if we go back to the first page and just look at the handwritten entry, again, as I understand it from Mr. Cameron, this is better, but totally unspecific, and so will disappoint. And then, sorry, can we zoom in, Lawrence? It says we need to find, thank you, Mr. Hunt, a sum of money and our approach, an approach that is a final one. No one is expecting us to solve this, but simply to be a bit more generous, I think is what that says. We have that at the 13th of July, and then if we just complete this exchange by looking at a response within the department internally, it's WITN 3499022. This is, again, from Mr. Jones to a range of officials within the department, and it explains that the Prime Minister's considered the Secretary of State's letter. Again, we now have a revised steer from him. And then I think we can just, if we look at the second and third bullet points under the heading on scheme reform and money, he felt something closer to, but in excess of the initial £25 million already identified would be more appropriate. He would like the policy unit to work with DH with the aim of identifying funding for this through the spending review process, ideally coming out ahead of the final outcome of DH's settlement if possible. Then, in fact, under the next heading on the consultation and written ministerial statement, the PM accepts that unfortunately the above will mean we don't have a substantive response ahead of recess. So the way in which you describe the outcome of this in your witness statement, Mr. Hunt, is, if we go to WITN 3499001, page 50, paragraph 33.40, so near the top of the page, you say this: my own recollection is that we ultimately settled on the option of making an additional £125 million available, including the sum publicly committed in March 2015, with the focus to be on increased financial support rather than the treatment-focused approach that I put forward. The detailed options for reform were to be consulted upon. So it ultimately, following those various exchanges, it came to the situation where you would find, in addition to the 25 million already allocated, the 100 million, but that 100 million would go into the payments under the schemes rather than accelerated treatment for hepatitis C, and that 100 million had to be found by the department. There was no further money being made available by the Treasury. Is that right?
Correct.
So note the time. I can pick up the rest of the chronology, I think, after lunch.
Very good. Well, let's take a break then now until 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock.